The first order of business in texturing our head is to lay out UVs. The foundation of our material will be based on hand-painted textures and what I call utility maps, which we will bake information from the geometry into texture format. Therefore, explicit texture coordinates is imperative. And the process of laying out UVs is kind of weird, especially if you've never done it before. So if that's you, I recommend you pause watching this course and jump over to CG Cookie's Fundamentals of Texturing, taught by Jonathan Lampel, where he goes over the fundamentals of UV layout and texture coordinates much better than I ever could. So I highly recommend you watch that first and then come back and pick up the process here, because I'm going to go straight into the UV layout process according to this project, and I need to assume that you know the basics at least. And so let's focus on the head. I can leave sculpt mode, go back to object mode. We're done with the hoodie for now. I will select the head object, and we'll go ahead and switch our workspace to UV editing, and then hit the / key on the number pad to go into local view so we can just focus on our head. And being such an organic shape, a human head is not easy to lay out. There's definitely going to be some stretching, and so the most important thing is to minimize the amount of stretching, especially minimize it in the most important places, like the face, nose, eyes, and mouth. And so that's the number one thing I'm concerned about. And then the second thing I want to be aware of is that to achieve minimal stretching, it will be okay if we put seams in obvious places. Now, generally, that's something you want to avoid, especially for someone like me who started UV layout before there was projection painting, because back then you had to make sure your seams matched in the texture by hand, and that was really cumbersome. So you didn't want to risk that happening, say, in the middle of the face. However, Blender paints with projection painting, and that means we can paint right over a seam, and Blender does the hard work of making sure those match perfectly. And so it's kind of good for me to know that going into the process, because we're going to have to cut some seams in obvious places, like right down the middle of the face, which would absolutely make me 15 years ago cringe. But with those things in mind, let's get started. I'm going to cut my first seam lopping off the neck and shoulders from the rest of the body. Since the neck is fairly primitive in that it's a cylinder, that's fairly easy to unwrap. And since it's mostly covered by the clothing, there's low pressure on this object. So I'm going to cut the first seam right here where the bottom of the jaw connects to the neck in almost a 90-degree angle. So it makes a lot of sense to cut the seam right here, holding Alt, and my screencast keys were turned off. There we go. With that edge loop selected, I can hit Control E to bring up our Edge Specials menu and choose Mark Seam. All right, now we'll see that highlighted in red. And also I can cut another one at the base of the collarbone where we cut off the bust, because this part of the mesh is entirely unimportant to the texture. So we'll just cut it off completely, Control E, Mark Seam. And in fact, we'll scale those UVs way down so that we don't waste texel density on that part of the mesh. Now, the last thing we need to do for this UV island is to cut a relief cut. If we were to unwrap this by itself, I'll hit the L key, which will limit the selection to where the seams are, if you have that enabled in the options. Very helpful for this process. And then hit the U key to bring up our UV mapping options, and we'll click Unwrap. All right, without a relief cut, the seam around the shoulders is really large, and then the seam at the top of the neck is really small. It has to do that unless we cut a relief cut, which I'm going to do right down the center, Control E, Mark Seam, L, and U, Unwrap. Now, these colors that we see in the UV editor represent the amount of stretching based on two different methods. And you can change that to angle, which I rarely use because I don't find it that helpful. Area should be the default, and that is much more helpful. Now, the goal is to have it colored blue, which represents the minimal amount of stretching. Green to yellow is like medium amount of stretching, and then orange to red is the maximum amount of stretching. So you want to avoid red and you want to end up on blue. Now, unfortunately, we can't go UV island by UV island because the algorithm accounts for the scale of each island. And so the rest of the head mesh not being unwrapped is kind of skewing the results. So unfortunately, I need to select everything and unwrap. Okay, and now we can see the coloration where we're approaching orange, so extremely stretched on the parts of the head that we haven't cut seams for. But the bottom of the bust is perfectly blue because it's a flat plane basically. So very easy to unwrap. And then our shoulders is in between the turquoise and blue range, which is okay. Ideally it would all be blue, but again, we're going to have stretching on such a organic shape no matter what. So in this range is going to be fine. Now, the unwrap options, we do have two. There's angle based and there's also conformal. And I've used both at various times, just depending on the result. So I like to try both, but I tend to lean on angle based. You can see that that has less yellow compared to conformal. We start to get into green, kind of lime green, so approaching yellow with this method. But I encourage you try both and pick which one works best for you. I'm going to stick with angle based. All right, so that's the first mesh island done. Next, I want to lop off the ear and separate it from the rest of the head. So I'm going to select an edge loop where the ear connects to the head. Make sure we have a complete loop selected. There we go. Now, there is an ear on the other side. You can quickly mirror your selection in the select menu all the way at the bottom, select mirror, or Shift-Control-M. I'm going to use that hotkey, Shift-Control-M, and you'll see that our selection over here disappeared and was moved to the other side. But in the options, you can choose Extend, which will add to the selection, which is what we want. Now I can hit Control-E and mark seam, and just remember to do that each time when symmetry is involved. And this is another reason we want to maintain perfect symmetry throughout the process, because it does make this a little bit easier. Now, for the ear, it's very strange. It's arguably the strangest, most organic shape, most difficult to unwrap on the entire head. So we will need to rely on some very obvious seams in order to make it unwrap the best we can. And so I think of the ear in two islands. All right, we've got kind of the helix all the way down to the earlobe and where that connects to the head. That's island one. And then I will completely separate the interior portion of the ear. All right, so that's where I need to cut the next seam, which this seam will be fairly hidden on some parts of the ear on this inner cavity. All right, so I'm going to basically go edge by edge. A very awkward seam, holding control and connecting shortest path all the way around. Here it definitely gets a little bit weird, but I'm trying to isolate the center and sticking the seam deep under the helix. Okay, I think that's it. Going to wireframe can help see if the edge is contiguous. Shift-Control-M, Control-E, and mark seam. Okay, I think that's good. And then the last thing I want to do is essentially butterfly the helix in half like you would a shrimp. All right, so we're going to cut an edge all the way around here. And then I will deselect one edge kind of at the apex of the curve. Really, any of these edges should work fine. But I'm going to deselect this one, Control-E, well, actually Shift-Control-M to mirror the selection, Control-E, mark seam. Let's select the whole head with A, and then you unwrap. All right, so now we get these ear islands, and that looks pretty good. The interior section is pretty much all blue. Maybe I can increase the margin. All right, that's the amount of space between each island. So let's go 0.1. It will unwrap again. Okay, now we can see a little bit more space, and that's going to be good. Definitely some weird shapes, but it's a weird ear. And at the end of this process, we'll use a UV texture grid to double check our stretching. But as long as we're in that blue and teal range, it should be okay. And next, I can focus on the face, which experience will say that the nose and mouth are the most prone to extreme stretching. And so the best way I have found to accommodate for that is simply cutting a seam right down the middle of the head, which kind of pains me to do. Again, the middle of the head is the most obvious place, but texture projection painting makes it a trivial issue. So I will hold Alt and click right down the center of the head, and then Shift L to deselect the islands we've already laid out, like the neck. And actually, before I do this, I should cut off the interior mouth cavity. So I'll come in here to where the lips are, and I'm going to cut a seam. Let's see, we'll do it right here at the front side of the lips. Alt-click to select the edge loop, Control-E, mark seam, and then Alt-click the center of the head again. Shift-L to deselect the neck and shoulders, and then Shift-L on the mouth cavity to deselect that. Okay, now we're cutting right down the middle of the head. Control-E, mark seam, and let's do a test unwrap. There we go. So the head does have a little bit of yellow, even kind of into orange a bit, at the corner of the mouth, also in the nostril, and also inside the eye. So we need to cut off the interior eye bag as well as the interior of the nostril, because those are extrusions inward, and that's very odd to unwrap. You get a lot of stretching. So let's cut off the inside of the nostril, see if we can select an edge loop, and no, I spiraled that geometry due to this cartilage structure. So C, circle select, and I'm just gonna have to hop over to the next edge loop. That's gonna be fine. Control E, actually Shift Control M to mirror the selection. Then Control E, mark seam. That will cut off the nostril, and then for the eye bag, Shift Alt clicking until we get the inside edge of our eyelid. There we go, Control E. I always forget to mirror the selection first, Control or Shift Control M, and then Control E, mark seam. All right, select everything you unwrap. Let's see if that relieves some pressure around the eye and the mouth. And it definitely did around the eye. The mouth is still a little bit stretched. Something to keep in mind, whenever you unwrap, it is based on the shape key that you have selected. So it would be smart to actually select the eye open and mouth closed shape key for minimal stretching of the eyelids, because we'll be unwrapping them closed. So with that shape key selected, let's hit U, unwrap again, and hopefully that will relieve even more pressure from the mesh. And it did in the eye, definitely. There's still a little bit of yellowy green in the corner of the mouth. Let's see. Another tool we have at our disposal is a relax function. So let's select the relax brush, I suppose is what it's called. At least it behaves like a brush. And let's just lightly brush along the corner of the mouth. Okay, now that feels less stretched, but the green is telling us that it is still stretched. And if we look at the geometry, wow, I did kind of put some really sharp points here in this edge loop. In hindsight, I kind of wish I had noticed that earlier, but we know it looks fine in the model. I'll just have to maybe deal with some stretched UVs. So let's get back to the point where we laid out, okay, right here. Okay, so that helps a little bit. That kind of makes it worse. I might have to be okay with the stretching here and wait for the UV grid test to see if it's a problem. But, you know, we're more in the green section than the yellow, I think. And so I might have to just compromise here. Let me try the other side. All right. The rest of the head is pretty good. I think that'll work out fine. And the nostril area too is pretty much all blue, a little bit of green. Okay, so that works out pretty well. Looks like I left local view at some point. Let's go back to local view. And let's cut some relief cuts for the nostril as well as the interior eye bag. We'll go back to our fixes shape key so the eyes are opened again. And these parts are really not that important, especially the eye bag. There's going to be no detail. It's never going to be seen. So I don't have to stress about what these seams look like. And I think I'm just going to cut right through half of the spherical shape all the way to the other seam. I'm leaving it a little bit open. Let's see, refocus here. I'm leaving it a little bit open here so that they're not separated into their own mesh islands, but they're still connected. And then Shift Control M, Control E, mark seam. And we'll do similarly to the nostril. I'm just gonna cut a relief cut first because I can almost see this as a cylinder with an open end, and then add a seam to the other end of the cylinder and leave one edge open. Control E, mark seam, Shift Control M, and then Control E, mark seam. All right, now we'll select everything. And okay, so since I manually modified the UVs in the corner of the mouth, the cheek area, if I unwrap the whole thing, those edits will be gone. And you know, it might be okay in this case. I didn't make that much adjustment, but if I want to maintain that, I should deselect with Shift L those islands, and then you unwrap. Or actually, that doesn't work because omitting those mesh islands causes the scale to be inconsistent. So let's undo that. The other option we have is to pin these verts. So with everything selected in edit mode, I will circle select. Oh, no, I can just use the island, L. So L to select the islands we want to keep, and I can go to UV and pin, or the P key. All right, so when they're pinned, they won't be modified. And this will allow me to select everything, you unwrap. And well, actually that layout looks about the same. Maybe I'm wrong about the scale issue. What I'm talking about is if one of your islands is scaled wrong, you see how it affects the color of everything else? And so when our head is laid out pretty well, the scale will cause it to appear in the yellow-orange spectrum depending on how inconsistent the scale values are. But since they're all staying pretty blue, I guess you could either pin the verts or just deselect and it'll be fine. Oh, and this also revealed that I accidentally cut in half the bottom edge, which is just not necessary. Control E, clear seam. Select everything, you unwrap. I kind of thought that the pin would tell the other islands to not intersect with it, but apparently that's not the case. Okay, that's fine. It's just a little visually confusing. The last thing we need to edit or UV unwrap is the mouth bag. And so again, this is kind of a cylindrical shape. And on the bottom, like the throat, I can select 3 of the 4 edges that make up the kind of box or cylinder. All right, these diamond junctions, so that we're selecting, 4 contiguous edges, and I will leave one of them open. All right, then I will cut down the center on the bottom side, one edge all the way till it meets another seam. Control E, mark seam, select everything, you unwrap. And that will take our mouth bag and lay it out quite well. Okay, now I can unpin everything, select it, UV, unpin, and then choose UV average island scale to make sure that they're scaled properly. So that adjusts them, fixing the scale issue, and then I can also UV pack the islands. All right, so that will just spread them evenly in the 0 to 1 space. However, this is not an optimal layout. We've successfully laid out individual mesh islands, but the last step will be to maximize their textile density. I am going to do this by first isolating the least important islands. Okay, so that means the bottom of the bust here. So let's go to our selection tool. I'll hit L, and then we'll scale this real small. The smaller the UV island, the less pixels it gets from the image. And so unimportant islands will be scaled small, and I'll move it off to the side. Let's see, this is the nostril pieces, I believe. This is the inside of the mouth, the eye cavity, so we'll move those off. They can also be scaled, which they're already kind of small, but we'll scale those down as well. And then are there any others? Well, in this case, the mouth cavity is not very important. It's kind of a big island, actually. So this will be some significant savings because we're not going to be opening the mouth with this character. If you were going to be doing that and rigging an animatable head, then you would want to reserve some textile density for the mouth cavity. So we don't need to do that for our portrait purposes for this project. So I'll scale that small as well. And then I think that leaves us with just the most important islands. So at this point, what I like to do is position the most important islands, but I'm going to be doing that with all islands selected so that the scale is maintained, or the scale that I've come up with, right? If I start to move and position islands individually, we will lose the benefit of that UV average island scale operation. So I'm going to select everything and rotate 90 degrees. Let's turn off proportional editing here. All right, and then basically anytime I'm scaling islands, I need to do that to all of them, but rotation and translation is fine to do individually. All right, so I'm positioning everything in the lower left corner as much as possible, just leaving a little bit of space. Let's say something like this. Take the next biggest mesh island. All right, kind of position it over here. select everything, and now I can think of these three largest islands as defining the overall texel density because I have all this space on the top side and right side. If I choose our 2D cursor as the pivot point, I've got everything selected to maintain the scale consistency, and hit S and scale up until my main three islands are as far as they can go, as close to the border as possible. Now we've significantly increased the texel density where it matters most. And it's naturally going to leave enough awkward negative space to fill in with our other islands. All right, so we'll select the ear and put them wherever it fits. We can go off of the median point as the pivot now and just move everything into position. These ear pieces are pretty awkward. Maybe this is my only option up here. So always starting with the biggest islands first and then filling in the space with the smaller islands is my preferred way to go. These are the nostrils. I mean, they really don't matter at this point, like where the islands go. Sometimes when there's a lot of islands, I like to position them near each other, so or near the relevant connection. So like the nostril, I would try and put close to the nose, right? Just so that if I'm looking at the texture, I've made it, slightly intuitive. But since there's not that many islands here, it's not really that important. All right, we can take all these small ones and put them anywhere because they are unimportant. And then the last one is another earpiece. I think that's it. And I think that is the end of our UV process, though I wanted to do that final check by creating a UV grid test texture. All right, so to do this, control space to leave maximum view, and I'm going to split our UV texture editor in half vertically and choose a shader editor for the bottom. Better save my file real quick just in case I lose everything I've done. There we go. And then to object mode, we'll tab out. With our head selected, I will delete the pore depth test, or instead of delete it, I'll just rename it to skin, and we will start over from scratch. Delete everything else, delete the principal BSDF, and add a new principal BSDF. That goes into surface. All right, so now we've got a fresh material, and really all I need in here is a texture, image texture node. I will create a new image texture. It's going to be 4096 by 4096, and I will call it UV test, and the generated type will switch to UV grid, and click OK. All right, now with that node selected, in our 3D view, I can go to our texture color mode. And control space to maximize. This shows us a perfect grid as it applies to our textures. The important thing to keep in mind for me is how much stretching there is in the face. And this is actually pretty low on stretching. Remember, we scaled the inside of the eye bag down, and so those squares are quite big. They're stretched because they're not important. You do not want to see that type of stretching on the nose. So let's make a quick example out of this. Tabbing into edit mode, I'll select some nose UVs. We'll choose proportional editing, and I'm going to scale down this. All right, so as I scale down the UVs, you can see the stretching becomes more prominent in the UV grid test. So if you see this kind of stretching on the nose or anywhere on the face that's important, that's a problem that needs to be fixed. That's what I'm trying to avoid. And if you follow the steps we just went over, you should be able to avoid it too. So we're going to undo that edit, go back to analyzing the UV test, and it does look pretty good. I'm happy with it. There is some stretching, of course. There's a little bit in the nose, but it's not a big deal. It's not going to cause problems. A little bit in the ear as well. But again, I really don't think these are going to cause problems. They are minor offenses when it comes to UV stretching, and so I'm going to call that finished. In the next video, we'll start baking some utility textures.